Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. Thanks for joining me today. So I went to a coffee shop and I found these cute little watercolors. They are the Watercolor Confection Vintage Pastel Set by Art Philosophy. This palette is $30 and it comes with this cute little card that you can test and swatch on, which I thought was really cute. It saved some time and I didn't have to waste a whole page of my sketchbook. So one thing I noticed immediately about these watercolors is that they have a lot of filler in them as opposed to pigment. And if you don't know what that is, then in short, when you're making watercolors, there is a combination of pigment and binder or filler. In watercolors, filler or binder is what makes the paint in simple terms, and pigment is just the color, but we'll get back to that in a second. This paint was actually really hard to push around on the paper. As you can see, it's kind of started pulling up the underlayers when I try and add more. In watercolor, this is really what you don't want, and it indicates a cheap paint. You want to be able to lay down as many washes as you need to be able to get as much detail as you want. Back to the binder or filler and pigment thing that I was talking about before, there's a high level of binder or filler as opposed to pigment in these watercolors to make them pastel. However, in watercolor, you can just use a regular saturated color and water it down to get the same effect, which is what I'll demonstrate later in the video. When you have a lot of binder, it's harder to push the paint around, and it makes this painting or these paintings and this palette really muddy from the get-go, which is really not what you want in watercolors. They're supposed to be bright and airy, but these paints move around almost like gouache, which is a thick watercolor. When I buy a watercolor set, I expect watercolor, not gouache, and you can kind of see my struggle with that in these clips, trying to make this paint work like watercolor when it really wants to work like gouache. So on this painting, I decided to do thinner layers. You already have to use thin layers in watercolor, but I used super thin layers. I found that no matter how much water control I had and how well I had brought the ratio of water and paint together on my brush, there was no stopping it from reactivating, which is a really upsetting quality about these watercolors in particular. At this point in my painting process, I am so frustrated with these, I just go ahead and bring out my Lucas Aquarelle Studio Grade watercolor set, which is my main palette at the moment. You can already see how the paint is reactivating underneath this new layer and how it's pushing it around like gouache instead of watercolor, and in general making a lot of patchy spots where the watercolor should lay flat. I think if I really tried hard enough, I could have salvaged this bust piece on the left, but I was just so frustrated with how these watercolors had performed, and I had already put in so many layers down on the paper that had eaten up the pulp of the paper and ruined it, so I decided that I would just kind of give up on this drawing. So, final thoughts on this watercolor palette. I don't like it at all. I have another palette by this brand, the tropical ones, and they are so much better. There's a better ratio of filler and pigment to binder and all that, and they work so beautifully, so I'm not sure why these other ones don't. They also included a black in their watercolor set, which I really don't like because they could have put another color there, whereas many watercolors don't even use black because it's just so inky looking. Lastly, I wanted to compare these watercolors to my usual set, which is the Lucas Studio Grade ones. So I'm going to do a little swatch of the pink in the Lucas and the pink in the vintage ones. When I was laying down the Lucas one, you can see how thin and watery this paint is and how easily it flows on the paper, whereas when I try to swatch one of the pinks, you can see how hard I have to push around and how it's just hard to get that same pastel pigment that I could so easily get with the Lucas one. And I'll do an up-close shot in just a second, but you can see how grainy the vintage one has made the paper as opposed to the Lucas, and how much smoother the Lucas one seems to go, whereas the vintage one has minor inconsistencies because of all the binder in it. This palette isn't bad at all, it's just not my favorite and it's not for me. It's more gouache, so if you like gouache, go ahead and I'd say this is a nice investment for you. But I like watercolor and that's not what I got. So anyway, this is the end of the video. If you like it, maybe give it a like and subscribe, and follow me over on Instagram at @etoileart, and thanks for watching.